Before we start the video, please don't forget to leave a like and write a comment. Your support means a lot to me and helps me continue creating more content. And now, without further ado, let's get started. I'd worked as a backcountry ranger at Saguaro Rim National Park in southern Arizona for 12 years. And not once in all that time had I told anyone about the things I'd seen. Who would believe me anyway? My coworkers would think I needed a psych evaluation. My family would worry. So I kept my mouth shut and did my job and tried to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real. But I knew better. What happened 4 months ago made sure of that. It started as a normal search and rescue operation. A man named Daniel Wren, 31 years old, had gone missing during a solo backpacking trip out past the Copper Wash trailhead. His sister reported him overdue when he didn't come home from a 3-day loop, and after the first calls went to voicemail, she phoned park services in a panic. These things happen more often than most visitors realize. People underestimate the desert. They run out of water. They wander off the marked routes. They get turned around in country that all looks the same once the sun is high. Usually we found them sitting in the shade of a rock overhang, sunburned and dehydrated, but alive. That morning, I got paired with Kyle Bishop. He'd only been with us for about 7 weeks. He was eager, followed the rules exactly, and looked at me like I had all the answers. We took the eastern part of the search area, out where the saguaros thinned and the ground broke into a maze of dry washes and low red mesas. The heat came up off the rock in waves you could see, bending the horizon, and the only sound for miles was the crunch of our boots and the occasional dry rattle of wind through creosote. You ever been part of a missing person search before? I asked Bishop as we picked our way down into a wash. No, sir. Just the training scenarios. Well, stick close. People don't always follow logical patterns when they're lost. They chase shade. They follow washes downhill hoping to hit water. They double back on themselves. Bishop nodded, his face tight with concentration under the brim of his hat. What are we looking for besides the man himself? He asked. Footprints, disturbed gravel, dropped gear, trash, anything that doesn't belong. We hiked for nearly 2 hours, calling Daniel's name and scanning the ground for sign. Nothing seemed out of place until Bishop stopped and pointed up the far slope of the wash. Wilson, what's that? At first I didn't see what he was pointing at. Then the wind shifted the shadows and I saw it. A door. A single wooden door, standing upright and completely alone on the bare slope about 100 yards ahead. No wall around it, no frame set into anything. Just a weathered door with a tarnished brass knob, planted in the desert like someone had dropped it there and walked away. That's not right, I said, already walking toward it. The door made no sense. We were miles from any road, any structure, any place a door could possibly belong. Even if some artist had hauled it out here as a prank, the odds of it standing perfectly upright in loose gravel, unmoved by the wind that scoured everything else flat, were almost none. And yet there it was. Maybe somebody's idea of art, Bishop suggested, but his voice betrayed his doubt. Let's check it out. We approached cautiously. The door didn't so much as tremble, even as a gust kicked grit against our legs and bent the brittle bush around it. It stood still, as if it were watching us. Below it, I noticed the gravel had been disturbed. Something had passed through here recently. Tracks, I said, kneeling. Adult-sized, barefoot. Bishop looked confused. Barefoot? Out here? The ground'll cook you. I nodded and stood. The tracks led away from the door, up over the lip of the wash and into rougher country. They weren't Daniel's. Too large, the wrong shape. But they were fresh, and they hadn't gotten there by accident. Let's follow them. Stay alert. The tracks led us through a twisted path for about a quarter mile. The desert got quieter the farther we went, the wind dropping off, the lizards and the cicadas going silent until all I could hear was our breathing and the grind of gravel under our boots. Then Bishop grabbed my arm. Listen, he whispered. A low moan drifted between the rocks, somewhere between pain and despair. Human, definitely, but barely recognizable as such. We started moving faster. following both the sound and the tracks until we came around a shoulder of rock into a shallow bowl of open ground. I'd seen a lot in my 12 years. Hikers with broken legs, heat stroke victims, a body once at the bottom of a dry falls. Nothing prepared me for what was in that bowl. A man lay curled on his side in the middle of the bare ground. He was completely naked, his skin scraped raw and streaked with so much blood it looked painted on. He shook and twitched, his limbs jerking like he was trying to crawl away from himself. Clutched against his chest was a hiking boot, and inside the boot was a human foot, cut cleanly at the ankle. God, Bishop whispered, going pale. My training kicked in even as my brain struggled to catch up. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger Wilson. We need immediate medical and law enforcement at my GPS coordinates. We have an injured adult male and evidence of violence, possible homicide. Over. The dispatcher responded, but I barely heard her. I moved toward the man slowly, motioning Bishop to stay back. Sir, I'm a park ranger. We're getting you help. Can you tell me your name? The man's eyes rolled toward me, bloodshot and unfocused. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came, just a wet clicking. I crouched closer, trying to find the source of the blood. He was covered in it, but I couldn't see a single wound on him. The blood wasn't his. The boot was a men's size, and the sock still on the severed foot was gray with a red band at the top. Daniel Wren's sister had told dispatch he wore gray hiking socks with a red stripe. I forced myself to look at the man's face again. No ID, nothing. His eyes suddenly locked with mine, and his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. The door, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. The door. What door? Where's Daniel? Where's the man you were with? I kept my voice level. The door, he repeated, over and over. Nothing else. The paramedics arrived 40 minutes later, 2 of them, both experienced with backcountry work. They approached professionally, but I saw the shock register when they took in the scene. That his? One of them asked quietly, nodding at the boot as she readied a backboard. Belongs to a missing man we're searching for, I confirmed. No sign of the rest of him. She nodded grimly and knelt beside the man who had stopped convulsing but kept up his mumbled mantra about the door. She checked his vitals while her partner drew up a sedative. Sir, I'm just going to look at your eyes, she said, leaning in with a pen light. The man's hand shot out and seized her wrist. He yanked her down and bit into the meat of her hand, between the thumb and the forefinger. She screamed, more startled than hurt. Her partner and I pulled her back while Bishop pinned the man's shoulders. He took him through the door, the man said, suddenly clear, his voice deeper, almost conversational. Then the sedative went in and his eyes rolled back. The next few hours passed in a blur. The man was flown to the regional hospital in Tucson for psychiatric evaluation. The severed foot was confirmed through the sock, and later DNA to belong to Daniel Wren. Search teams combed the entire area but found no trace of the rest of him. The unidentified man had no prints on record, no missing persons report matching his description, no clue to who he was or where he'd come from. The investigation stalled inside a week. Without the rest of the body, without any explanation for the man's presence out there, without a single lead, the case hit a wall. The bloodied man stayed nonverbal at the psychiatric facility. Tests showed no drugs in his system, but severe psychological trauma of unknown origin. That was 4 months ago. I tried to go back to normal duties. Patrolling trails, checking permits, hauling out the trash people leave behind. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. At night, I dreamed of that door standing alone on the slope, perfectly still, while everything around it moved in the wind. I heard the man's voice change as he spoke his last coherent sentence before the sedative took him. He took him through the door. A week passed, and the desert kept its secrets. I tried to focus, but my mind kept circling back to that bowl of open ground, to the blood, to Daniel Wren's foot in the boot. I wasn't sleeping through the night anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that not quite smile and heard that scratchy voice talking about a door. Bishop was shaken too, but he turned it into determination. I want to find that man, he told me as we geared up for a morning patrol. Even if it's just the rest of him, his family deserves that. Our assignment took us back to the eastern quadrant, not far from where we'd found the bloodied man. A rare gray overcast had rolled in ahead of the monsoon, and the light was flat and strange, the mesas looking closer than they were. The desert felt different somehow, like it was holding its breath. "Let's split up to cover more ground," I suggested, when we reached a fork where two washes met. "You take the ridge on the east side. I'll follow the wash. Radio check every 15 minutes. Bishop nodded and adjusted his hat. "Sounds good. 15 on the dot." I watched him climb the ridge until the rocks swallowed him up. The first check-in came right on time. Nothing unusual on his route. I told him the same and kept looking. 15 minutes later, I keyed the radio again. "Bishop, check in. Over." Nothing. "Bishop, do you copy?" "Over." Silence. I waited a full minute and tried again. Nothing but static. My stomach dropped. Maybe his battery had died. Maybe he'd dropped into a dead zone behind the ridge. Maybe he'd just gotten distracted. Or maybe not. I started toward where he'd last called from, moving fast but watching my footing on the loose rock. The desert had gone dead quiet. No cicadas, no wind, just my own boots. I called his name every few yards, but the flat gray air seemed to swallow the sound. 20 minutes later, I found it. Bishop's radio lying in the gravel, his ranger hat beside it. I picked up the radio. It was still on, battery full. The hat looked placed there, set down deliberately, not dropped in a struggle. "Bishop!" I shouted, turning a full circle. "Bishop!" My voice went out and died against the rock. No answer. I searched the ground for tracks, for scuffs, for anything showing where he'd gone. The wash ran on ahead, but Bishop's boot prints simply stopped. No drag marks, no sign he'd left the wash. He had just vanished. I radioed dispatch, and within the hour, every available ranger was rolling. By nightfall, the county sheriff had a command post set up. Dogs came in. A helicopter with thermal imaging swept the whole quadrant. We searched every wash, every overhang, every mine adit and cave in that country. 5 days. 5 days of climbing heat and growing desperation. I barely slept, catching an hour or two in a tent at the command post before heading back out. I knew what happens to people lost out there. Every hour made it less likely we'd find him alive. On the 5th day, they scaled the search back. Missing persons flyers went up at the trailheads. Bishop's photo ran on the Tucson News. His parents drove down from Phoenix and stood at the command post looking hollowed out. I couldn't meet their eyes. What could I have said? That their son had vanished without a trace in country that dozens of trained people had walked grid by grid? That the last person to see him was me? I kept thinking about the bloodied man, about Daniel Wren, about that phrase. He took him through the door. And now Kyle Bishop was gone too. 3 days after Bishop was officially declared missing, I went back on patrol. My supervisor thought routine would help. I took a loop near the Copper Wash trailhead and made myself focus on small tasks. Checking a trail register, bagging trash, nodding to the handful of hikers who passed in the cooler morning hours. Late in the afternoon, I crossed a wide flat between two low mesas. The desert grass grew tall there, the tan seed head swaying in a light breeze. About 100 yards ahead, I saw a pattern in the flat, something too regular to be natural. As I got closer, I understood what I was looking at, and I went cold. 13 mule deer lay in the flat, arranged in a perfect circle, their heads pointing inward like the spokes of a wheel. Every one of them was positioned exactly the same way, legs folded under the body as if they'd all lain down to rest in the same instant. Too perfect. Too deliberate. I approached slowly, looking for signs of a predator, a poacher, anything. But there was no blood, no wounds, No sign of a struggle. The deer looked completely fine, their coats smooth and clean. Then I noticed their eyes. All 13 stared straight up, wide open. They weren't bloated, weren't drawing flies. They looked freshly dead, maybe hours at most. As I walked around the circle, a chill crawled up my spine. Their eyes moved. At first I told myself it was the light, but as I walked the perimeter, each dead deer's eyes followed me, the way the eyes in an old portrait seemed to. Sweat broke out on my forehead despite the heat. This wasn't possible. Dead eyes don't track you. Dead animals don't arrange themselves in circles. I made myself take pictures from every angle. My hands shook so badly I had to brace the camera against my chest. Through the lens, the scene looked almost ordinary, just dead wildlife. But I knew what I'd seen. I radioed it in, keeping my voice professional despite the fear. "Dispatch, Ranger Wilson. I've got multiple deer deaths at my location requesting wildlife management." My supervisor, David Ruiz, arrived with a wildlife biologist an hour later. They examined the circle, taking samples and measurements. Nobody said a word about the arrangement. I stood back, watching their faces. "You notice anything strange about them?" I finally asked David. He looked up from his clipboard. "Like what?" "They're in a perfect circle," I gestured. "And their eyes. Watch them when you walk around." David looked unhappy but walked the perimeter slowly. I watched his face, waiting for the moment of recognition, the shock when he saw the eyes following him. His expression stayed flat. "Not sure what I'm supposed to be seeing, Wilson," he said. I crouched beside one of the deer. Its eye was on me, still bright, not clouded. "You don't see this? They're tracking movement, all of them." David put a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, you've been through a lot lately. First Wren, then Bishop. Maybe you should take some time." "I know what I'm seeing," I said, sharper than I meant to. "This isn't natural. Something is wrong here." The biologist found no obvious cause of death. No wounds, no poison, no sign of disease. They loaded the deer into a truck for testing. I watched them drive off, feeling like evidence was slipping through my fingers. The results came back 3 days later, inconclusive. 13 healthy adult animals that had simply stopped living, all at once, all in the same place, all in the same position. Science had no explanation. That night I dreamed of the flat. The circle of deer was still there, still perfect, still watching. But now Kyle Bishop stood in the center. He looked the same as the last time I'd seen him, except for his eyes. They matched the deer's, wide open, unblinking, following me as I came closer. "Don't go through the door," he whispered. I tried to ask him what he meant, where he was, what had happened, but no sound came out of my mouth. The deer began to rise, still folded into their resting positions, floating up off the ground like they'd lost all their weight, eyes never leaving mine. Bishop drifted up too, his boots leaving the earth. "Don't go through the door," he repeated, fading as he rose higher. "He's playing a game with us, don't go through the door." I woke, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. The clock beside my bed read 3:17 a.m. The bloodied man, the door, Bishop in my dream. Don't go through the door. I sat in the dark, listening to my own ragged breathing. Was I losing my mind? Trauma? Hallucinations? Or was something impossible happening in the country I'd worked for 12 years? I didn't know which answer scared me more. 1 month had passed since Bishop vanished. The desert had taken him just like it had taken Daniel Wren, leaving nothing but questions that kept me up at night. I'd started volunteering for night patrols, partly because I couldn't sleep anyway, but mostly because I hoped being alone out there might help me make sense of what was happening. The dark didn't scare me. After 12 years, I knew the ordinary sounds of the desert night, the yip of coyotes, the whir of nighthawks, the ticking of rock giving up the day's heat. What scared me was when those sounds stopped. That night I was patrolling the old mining district on the park's southern edge, a stretch of country dotted with collapsed adits and fenced-off shafts left over from the copper boom a century back. My headlamp cut a cone through the black as I followed the trail. The district was eerie enough by day. At night, with only stars and my lamp, it was another thing entirely. I'd been walking about 2 hours when I noticed it. The silence. One moment there were crickets and the far-off cry of an owl. The next, nothing. Complete stillness. I stopped and switched off my lamp, letting my eyes adjust. The silence was absolute. No insects, no wind, though I could still feel a breeze on my face. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in my ears. Then the temperature dropped. The mild desert night went suddenly, deeply cold, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. My breath fogged in front of me. I switched the lamp back on and swept it across the trail. Nothing looked wrong, but the silence and the cold raised every hair on my body. I took a few careful steps forward, checking the rocks and the mouths of the old workings on either side of the trail. That's when I saw him. A tall figure standing motionless among the scattered mine tailings. He was too far off to see clearly, just a shape darker than the dark around it. But he was watching me. I knew it the way you know someone is standing behind you. "Hello," I called. My voice sounded wrong in the silence, like it didn't carry the way it should. "This is Park Ranger Wilson. Identify yourself." The figure didn't move, didn't answer. I should have radioed for backup. I should have kept my distance. But after a month of unanswered questions, of searching for Bishop, of trying to make sense of the bloodied man and his ramblings about a door, I needed answers more than I needed to be careful. I moved toward him, my lamp jouncing with each step. As I got closer, details came clear that made me slow down. The man was unusually tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. His skin was pale, not just white but translucent, the way a fish's belly is, with darker lines beneath it that might have been veins. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were completely black. No whites, no iris, just wet black orbs that somehow still seemed to be fixed on me. I halted about 15 feet away, my hand drifting to the pepper spray on my belt. Not that I thought it would do anything against whatever this was. "Good evening, Ranger Wilson," the man said. His voice had an accent I couldn't place, not quite anything I recognized. It sounded old, like a way of speaking from another century. "How do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep steady. "I know all my guests." He smiled, and I saw his teeth, too many of them, and all filed to points. "My name is Elias Crane. I've been looking forward to meeting you properly." Crane. The bloodied man hadn't given a name, but the name still landed on me like cold water, as if some part of me had been waiting to hear it. "What are you doing in the park after dark?" I asked, falling back on protocol because it was all I had. "This district is closed to the public." Crane laughed, a sound like dry corn stalks rubbing together. "Are you enjoying our game, Ranger Wilson?" "What game? What are you talking about?" "The search. Also the discovery. The fear." He tilted his head at an angle that was subtly, deeply wrong, too far to one side. "Guests don't need to understand the rules. They only need to play." My mouth had gone dry. "Where's Kyle Bishop? Where's Daniel Wren?" Crane's smile widened. "Your young friend plays well. The other one too." Present tense. Plays. They were alive. "Where are they?" I took a step forward, anger overriding fear for a second. "What did you do to them?" I opened doors. They walked through. His black eyes never blinked. "As will you, in time." "What does that mean?" "What doors?" But Crane was already stepping backward, and the way he moved was wrong, as if he were gliding rather than walking, his outline blurring at the edges with each second. He receded into the dark between the tailings piles. I lunged forward, aiming my lamp at him. "Wait, tell me where they are." I pushed through the brittle brush, branches whipping my arms. My beam found nothing but empty desert. Crane was gone. No footprints, no disturbed gravel, Nothing to show he'd ever stood there. I searched for almost an hour, walking wider and wider circles. Nothing. It was like he'd simply stopped existing the moment I couldn't see him. Slowly, the ordinary sounds came back. A cricket started up, then more. Small things rustled in the brush. The temperature climbed back to the mild warmth of a desert night. Everything was normal again, but nothing would ever be normal again. The next morning, I told David Ruiz what had happened. We sat in his cramped office at headquarters. I stuck to the facts: what Crane looked like, how strangely he talked, what he knew about Bishop and Wren. As I spoke, David's face went gray. When I said the name Crane, he looked like he might be sick. "You're sure he called himself Elias Crane?" David asked, his voice tight. "Yes. He knew my name without me telling him. He talked about Bishop and Wren like they're still alive." David stood abruptly and turned to the window. "I think you've been working too hard, Wilson. The stress of losing Bishop, the Wren case, it's getting to you." "This wasn't stress or imagination," I said firmly. "I know what I saw. What you're describing isn't possible." He still wouldn't look at me. "I want you to take a few days off. Clear your head." "David, I'm not..." "That's an order, Wilson." He finally turned back, his face shut like a door. "Take 3 days, get some rest." I knew arguing would get me nowhere. I nodded and left, my frustration burning. David knew something. His reaction to that name had been too immediate, too strong, to mean nothing. I didn't take the 3 days. I showed up for my shift the next morning as if the conversation had never happened. David looked unhappy when he saw me but didn't send me home. We both pretended everything was fine. 3 days later, I was filing reports in the ranger station when I heard voices from the break room. I recognized them as Ray Ortega and Marcus Hale, both senior rangers who'd been with the park longer than I had. "Third one this year," Ray was saying, his voice low but tense. "First Wren, then the kid, now Crane's back. It's happening again." "Keep your voice down," Marcus hissed. "You know we're not supposed to talk about it." "Somebody should warn the newer people. Wilson's already run into him." "And say what? Watch out for the thing that lives in the doors? They'd think we're insane." "Better insane than gone, or whatever happened to Bishop." I stepped into the doorway. Both men fell silent at once, looking at me with an expression that mixed guilt and alarm. "What do you know about Crane?" I asked directly. Ray and Marcus exchanged a glance. Marcus gave a small shake of his head. "Nothing," Ray said finally. "Just rumors." "You just said he's back. That means he's been here before. What is he? What does he want?" "Drop it, Wilson," Marcus said, standing. "For your own good." They walked past me, ending the conversation. I stood in the empty break room, more confused and more certain than ever that everyone around me knew more than they'd say. Over the next few days, I tried to pull information out of the other senior rangers. No one would talk. Some pretended not to know what I meant. Others gave me the same advice. Drop it, forget what I saw, focus on the job. But I couldn't forget. Not the unnatural silence. Not Crane's black eyes and pointed teeth. Not his words about Bishop and Wren still playing his game. Whatever was happening in Saguaro Rim went far beyond lost hikers and strange animal deaths. The senior staff knew about it. They had protocols for it. And they were terrified of Elias Crane. I was going to find out why, with or without their help. Bishop and Wren were still out there somewhere, and now I had a name for what had taken them. Elias Crane, the pale man with black eyes who spoke of games and guests and doors. I just needed to figure out the rules before I became another name on a flyer at the trailhead. Several weeks went by after that encounter. The desert went back to normal, but I didn't. I flinched at every shadow. Every unexpected sound startled me. I kept scanning the rocks for a too-tall figure with black eyes, but he never showed. I tried talking to other rangers about Crane, and most just gave me blank looks or changed the subject. The few who knew the name, like Ray and Marcus, refused to discuss it. That told me everything I needed to know. One morning, low clouds still clinging to the mesas, I hiked out along an old prospector's route near the Dripping Springs Seep. This spot wasn't on any tourist map. It was too far out and too rough for casual hikers. Perfect for someone who wanted to hide something. I'd been walking about 2 hours when I came into a small basin I'd never seen before, and what I found there stopped me cold. 4 people sat around a folding camp table in the center of the basin. At first glance, they looked like ordinary backpackers taking a break. 3 men and a woman in hiking clothes playing cards, a few cans of beer sweating on the table between them. But something was off. They were too still, too quiet. None of them looked up when I got close. "Hello," I called, my hand moving to my radio. No response. I came closer, boots grinding on the gravel. Still nothing. When I was about 10 feet out, I understood why they weren't reacting. They weren't people. They were figures, mannequins of some kind. No, that wasn't right either. They were too detailed, too perfect. Their skin had pores, fine wrinkles, faint veins beneath the surface. One man had stubble that looked real enough to scratch. The woman had a small scar above one eyebrow. Their eyes were the worst part, glassy but somehow aware, like the eyes of a mounted animal. I circled the table slowly. Each figure held a hand of cards mid-game. The beer cans were positioned as if caught in the act, one tilted toward a figure's frozen lips. They wore good gear, name-brand jackets and boots, a nice watch on one wrist. Everything about them looked real except for the absolute stillness. I took out my phone and started shooting. Close-ups of their faces, their hands, the cards, wide shots of the whole scene. I even recorded a short video, narrating in a voice steadier than I felt. 4 figures arranged around a camp table. Material unknown, but extremely lifelike. No tags or maker's marks visible. Scene appears staged to resemble hikers on a break. I reached out and hesitated, then pressed the nearest figure's shoulder. It felt like skin, warm and slightly soft where I pushed. I yanked my hand back and wiped it on my pants. These weren't store mannequins. I didn't know what they were, but no manufacturer made anything this real. And who would carry 4 life-sized figures miles into the backcountry just to arrange them around a table? I radioed it in, keeping it simple. "This is Ranger Wilson. I found something unusual at my location. 4 lifelike figures arranged around a camp table, requesting forensic assistance." The dispatcher asked if I'd found human remains. I didn't know how to answer. Negative, not remains. But I need someone to see this. I gave my coordinates and was told a forensic tech would meet me at the trailhead in 2 hours to walk back in. I spent another 30 minutes documenting everything. Measuring the table, noting where the cans sat, even writing down the specific cards each figure held. The woman had a full house. The man across from her was bluffing with a pair of 3s. Before I left, I set a few small cairns at the edge of the basin so I could find it again easily. I took one last look at the frozen card players and hiked out. The tech who met me was a man named Foley. He didn't say much on the walk-in, just nodded now and then as I described what I'd found. His lack of surprise bothered me. "You seen something like this before?" I asked. Foley checked his kit before answering. "Worked in this park 30 years. I've seen a lot of things." Not really an answer, but I was getting used to that. When we finally reached the basin, I stopped at the edge, confused. The table was still there. The cans were still there, exactly where I'd documented them. Cards were scattered across the surface, the same hands I'd noted, but the figures were gone. "This isn't possible," I said, rushing to the table. "They were right here, 4 of them sitting around the table." Foley didn't seem surprised. He pulled on gloves and began bagging the cans. "They were right here," I repeated, pulling out my phone. "Look, I have pictures." I opened my gallery and went cold. The photos were there. The basin, the table, the cans. the cards, but in every shot, the table was empty. No figures, no impossibly real people playing poker in the middle of nowhere. "This is wrong," I said, scrolling frantically. They were here. I touched one. It was warm. Foley kept working, sealing evidence bags and labeling them. "You don't seem surprised," I said, watching him. He glanced up. "Like I said, I've been here a long time." "So you've seen this before? Things that appear and vanish? Things that don't show up in photographs?" Foley sealed another bag. "We're just collecting physical evidence today, Ranger Wilson. That's my job." He worked methodically, gathering the cards, taking a sample from the table, photographing the site. I stood back, my frustration rising. The proof of what I'd seen was disappearing in front of me, and the one person who might have answers was carefully saying nothing. When he finished, he had a small collection of bagged items: cans, cards, a sample of the tabletop, soil from beneath it. Physical evidence that something had been here, but nothing to prove what. "What happens to all this?" I asked as we hiked out. "Standard analysis. I file a report." "And then?" Foley adjusted his pack. "Then it goes in the files with all the others." All the others? So there were more things that couldn't be explained. "Does this have anything to do with Elias Crane?" I asked. Foley stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. He turned, and for the first time his face was serious. "Where did you hear that name?" "I met him, in the mining district. Tall man, black eyes, too many teeth." Foley's face lost what color it had. "You spoke with him?" "Yes. He knew my name. Talked about Bishop and Wren like they're still alive." Foley looked away, then kept walking without another word. We hiked the rest of the way in silence. At the trailhead, he took his bags and left without saying goodbye. I spent that night going through my photos again and again, trying to understand how 4 lifelike figures could simply vanish. Not just from the basin, but from my documented evidence. I knew what I'd seen. I knew I hadn't imagined it. 3 days later, I was patrolling a stretch of high country near the park's northern boundary, where the desert gave way to pinon and juniper and the air was a few degrees cooler. I was checking a backcountry campsite when a game trail caught my eye, leading off into a stand of juniper. Something about it pulled at me. The way the light fell through the branches, or maybe some movement at the edge of my vision. I followed the narrow path, pushing aside low limbs. The trees grew thicker as I walked, and the shade deepened until I was moving through a green-gray gloom. The air felt cooler here, and still. Then the trees opened into a small clearing, and I saw it. A door, standing alone in the middle of the clearing. No wall, no frame set into anything. Just a weathered wooden door with an ornate iron latch, the kind you'd find on some old ranch house, planted upright in the dirt where nothing like it should be. I'd heard talk about the doors, rumors among the rangers, cut off fast whenever a supervisor came near. Never go near the doors, they said. Never touch them. Never open them. Now I understood why Foley had gone pale, why the bloodied man had repeated the door like a prayer, why Bishop in my dream had warned me not to go through. The door stood a little over 7 feet tall, and around it there was nothing, just clearing and trees and sky. The wood looked old but not rotted, gone silver-gray like driftwood with faint carvings worked into the panels. It didn't belong here. Nothing like it should exist in a desert park 1,000 miles from wherever it had come from. I took out my phone and started recording, narrating quietly. Freestanding door in a clearing near the northern boundary. No attached structure. Appears very old but sound. Ornate ironwork inconsistent with park construction. I circled it slowly, keeping my distance. Unlike the figures at the table, the door cast a shadow across the ground. A real, physical shadow, not an illusion. I wanted to leave. I should have called it in or gotten far away from the thing, but something about it held me there. I felt like I needed to open it and see what was on the other side. I moved closer, one slow step at a time. The air around the door felt different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. My radio hissed static as I neared it, and I flinched. I stood in front of the door. The iron latch was cold and dark. 13 carved panels ran across it in a pattern that almost looked like faces if I stared too long. Before I could change my mind, I reached out and put my hand on the latch. Right away, I felt pressure against my whole body, like I was trying to walk into a hurricane wind. I couldn't breathe. My vision darkened at the edges. A terror washed over me that went far beyond ordinary fear, an animal certainty that if that door opened, I would end. Images flashed through my mind. Bishop's empty hat on the gravel, the circle of deer with their moving eyes, Crane's too wide smile, and under all of it, a whisper. Not yet. Not your time. Step back. I stumbled backward and fell hard onto the ground. The pressure vanished instantly. I could breathe again. The terror drained away, leaving me shaking in the dirt. I scrambled back until my spine hit a juniper trunk, gasping. The door just stood there, ordinary. Just a strange object in a place it didn't belong. But I knew better now. The door wasn't only out of place. It was wrong. It was dangerous. It was a way to somewhere else, exactly as Crane had said. I didn't take any more pictures. I didn't call it in. I just marked the spot on my GPS and left, walking fast back toward the main trail. I needed to understand what was happening before I told anyone else what I'd found. That night I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, searching for answers. I started with the park's history, digging through digitized archives of the old regional newspapers. If Crane had been here before, if the doors had been appearing for years, there might be records. It took hours, but eventually patterns emerged. In 1931, 3 prospectors vanished from the district within a single month. A contemporary article mentioned strange structures reported in remote washes. In 1959, a family of 4 disappeared while camping near the springs. A week before, several travelers had reported a door standing alone in the desert, leading nowhere. In 1984, 2 rangers went missing during routine patrols. Visitors that season described doors in impossible places throughout the backcountry. And in 2003, 5 separate people disappeared over one summer, each case mentioning unusual structures in the witness statements. Doors set into open ground, door frames standing among the rocks, old ranch doors miles from any ranch. Now it was happening again. Daniel Wren, Kyle Bishop, and Elias Crane back, talking about games and guests and doors. The doors weren't a random oddity. They were a pattern, a cycle that repeated every couple of decades, and somehow Crane was tied to all of it. I printed the articles and spread them across the table, hunting for any detail I might have missed. The descriptions of the doors were consistent across the decades. Always wooden, always old, always standing where no door could stand, always leading nowhere. The disappearances followed the same shape, people vanishing without a trace, often after reporting strange sightings. What did Crane want? Why the elaborate game? And most of all, were Bishop and Wren still alive somewhere, as he'd hinted? I didn't have answers yet, but I had something to work with now. Evidence going back nearly 100 years. Proof I wasn't losing my mind. The doors were real. Crane was real. And whatever game he was playing had been going on for a very long time. I slept badly that night. The article still spread across the table when I gave up around 2 in the morning and went to bed. I woke to the sound of a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against wood. I lay still, listening. My house sat at the end of a gravel road with no neighbors close, and no one came knocking at that hour. The clock read 3:17. The knock came again, 3 raps, patient and even, and it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the hall closet. I got up, my heart hammering, and picked up the flashlight I kept by the bed. The hallway was dark and cold. Cold the way the desert had gone cold in the mining district. Cold enough to fog my breath inside my own house. The closet door, an ordinary hollow core door I'd walked past 1,000 times, stood at the end of the hall. As I watched, the knob turned slightly, then stopped. Something on the other side was testing it. "I know what you are," I said into the dark. and my voice shook. "I'm not opening it." The knocking stopped. For a long moment there was nothing but my own breathing and the tick of the cooling walls. Then, from behind the closet door, a voice low and familiar and threaded with amusement. "You opened the closet at your uncle's cabin, James. You were 7, and the lantern was out, and you were so sure the door out of that room was the closet. You opened it in the dark? Do you remember what was waiting?" I did remember. I'd buried it so deep I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. The small hand that closed over mine in the black, the breath against my ear. "I've been waiting for you." I'd screamed until my uncle came, and there had been nothing there, only coats and a mothball smell, and everyone had said it was a nightmare. "That wasn't a nightmare," the voice said, answering the thought I hadn't spoken. "I have been waiting a long time. You are almost ready to come and see." I backed down the hall, refusing to turn my back on the closet, and sat in the living room with every light burning until the sky went gray in the east. When the sun was fully up, I made myself open the closet. Coats, boxes, a vacuum cleaner, nothing else. But on the shelf, where I kept nothing but spare bulbs and a toolbox, sat a single item that hadn't been there before. A small brass hinge, old and green with age, the kind you'd take off a door long since fallen to pieces. I threw it in the trash. That night, I dug it out again and put it in a drawer, because throwing it away felt like a rule I didn't understand the consequences of breaking. After that, I understood something Esther would later put into words for me. The doors were not only out there in the backcountry. Once Crane had your scent, the seam could open anywhere. The wilderness had never been the dangerous place. I had. The heat came early the next week, the monsoon still holding off, the sky a hard white. Ray Ortega and I had been assigned to patrol together that Tuesday, checking the less traveled routes for storm damage and stranded hikers. We worked our way up a canyon where the walls closed in and the shade came as a relief, the rock striped red and gold above us. "Forecast says the storms finally break tonight," Ray said, eyeing the sky. I nodded, but my mind was somewhere else. Since finding the door 4 days earlier, I'd been distracted, replaying the experience on a loop. That awful pressure, the terror, the whispered warning. I hadn't told anyone, not even Ray, who seemed more likely than most to believe me. We followed a faint path that branched off the main route into a side canyon. This section rarely saw visitors. Too tight, too rough, and without the views that drew people in. Perfect for whatever didn't want to be found. "You've been quiet," Ray said after we'd walked an hour. "Still chewing on those figures you found?" "Among other things," I said, stepping over a slab of fallen rock. "You ever come across anything out here that shouldn't exist? Things that don't add up?" Ray's pace slowed a little. "What kind of things?" Before I could answer, a sound cut through the canyon, high and unmistakable. "Help me. Please, somebody help me." A child's voice. Ray and I froze, looking at each other to be sure we'd both heard it. The voice came again, more desperate. "I'm down here. Please, help me out." We moved fast, scrambling toward the sound. It led us off the path and deeper into the side canyon, between boulders and up a dry slope. "Hello," I called. "Park rangers. Keep talking so we can find you." "I'm here. I'm down here." The voice sounded young, maybe 8 or 9. We climbed over a jumble of rock and came into a pocket of open ground. And there, half hidden by brush, was the mouth of an old mine shaft. A collar of stacked stone ringed it, and a few rotting timbers lay across the opening, gaps between them wide enough to see through but too narrow for a child to climb out. The voice was coming from inside. "Help me. Please. I can't get out." I approached the shaft, my boots sliding on loose scree. Ray hung back, and something in his face had gone wary. "We're here to help," I called, leaning toward a gap between the timbers. "Are you hurt? How did you get down there?" I couldn't see much. The shaft dropped into blackness, its depth lost in shadow. The heat of the day seemed not to reach it. A cool, stale air rose from the opening. "I fell," the child's voice said. "I can't climb out. Please help me." Something was wrong. The shaft looked ancient, its stones fitted without mortar, the timbers gray and soft with rot. It didn't match any working I'd ever seen on the park's maps. "Wilson," Ray's voice was tight. "Step back from there." I glanced at him. "There's a kid down there, Ray." "No." He said it flat and hard. "There isn't." I turned back to the shaft, confused. The voice was as clear as anything, echoing faintly off the stone. "Please, mister, I'm scared of the dark. Just move the boards and help me out." I reached for the edge of a timber, ready to shift it aside. "I know you, James Wilson." The voice changed mid-sentence, dropping several octaves into something that was not a child, something adult and amused. "I know about the deer that watch you." Cold sweat broke across my back. The voice went lower, almost intimate. "You were at your uncle's cabin. The lantern went out. You woke in the pitch black and couldn't find the door. Something was breathing in the corner of the room. Something that whispered your name and told you it had been waiting for you." My chest went tight. I'd never told anyone about that night. Not my parents, not a single friend. I'd convinced myself over the years it was a nightmare, a scared kid's imagination. "You still check the corners of a room when you're alone," the voice said. "You still leave a light on." I stumbled backward from the shaft, almost falling. Ray grabbed my arm and hauled me away. "Run," he said, his face bloodless. We ran, crashing down the slope, sliding on scree, brush tearing at us. Behind us I heard laughter. Deep, satisfied laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We didn't stop until we reached the patrol truck, both of us gasping, shirts soaked through. Ray leaned on the hood, hands on his knees. "You okay?" I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. "That thing," I finally managed. "It knew things about me, things nobody knows." Ray straightened, his expression grim. "They always do." I looked at him sharply. "You've heard it before." He didn't answer right away. He just opened the driver's door. "Get in. We need to talk, but not here." The drive back was tense and silent. Ray kept checking the mirrors, gripping the wheel too hard. I stared out at the passing rock, trying to make sense of a voice that had known my deepest, most buried fear. When we reached the station, Ray didn't go inside. He parked around the back in a small lot out of sight of the road. "We shouldn't be seen talking about this," he said, killing the engine. "About what, exactly?" I asked. "What was that thing at the shaft?" Ray rubbed his face with both hands, looking suddenly much older than his years. "How long have you been a ranger here, James?" 12 years? He didn't wait for more. "I've been here 20. First 7 were normal. Lost hikers, wildlife, the usual. Then I started noticing things that shouldn't be there. I thought of the figures that vanished from my photos, the door in the clearing, Crane with his black eyes and pointed teeth. Why doesn't anyone talk about it, I asked. If this has been happening for years, why keep it secret? Orders from above, Ray said. Strict policy. We document, we report to senior staff, and we never ever discuss it with the public or with the junior people. He gave me a tired look. Though you've seen enough now that I guess you're in the club. What club? The ones who know what's really out there. Ray stared through the windshield at the heat shimmer rising off the lot. The doors, the voices, the dead animals. They're all Crane. My mouth went dry. You know about Crane? Ray's face hardened. I saw him once. 8 years ago, right before Ranger Delgado disappeared. What happened? Delgado and I were checking the backcountry sites near the springs. We split up to cover more ground. When I got to our meeting point, Crane was there instead. Ray's voice had gone flat. Same as you described. Too tall, black eyes, that wrong smile. He told me Delgado had chosen a different path. Said I would too someday. What did he mean? I don't know. But Delgado was never found. Not a trace. Ray turned to look at me directly. These things we see, they're not ghosts, not monsters the way you'd think. It's something worse. What then? Tests, Ray said. Games. Cranes playing with us, seeing who breaks the rules and who follows them. What rules? Don't open the doors. Don't answer voices coming from places nothing should be. Don't follow lights out in the dark. Ray ticked them off on his fingers. The senior people know them all. They've been passed down for decades. I thought of the door in the clearing, how I'd put my hand on the latch despite every instinct screaming at me not to. What happens if you break the rules? I asked, though I already suspected. You disappear, Ray said simply. Like Delgado, like Bishop, like all the others over the years. We sat in silence, the weight of it settling between us. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked. After all these years of secrecy. Because you've already met Crane face to face. You're already in the game. Ray's face was grave. And because that thing at the shaft knew things about you it shouldn't have known. That means you're being watched. Tested. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the heat. So what do? We follow the rules, Ray said. We document what we see. We report it up the chain. And we don't interact with any of it. That's how we stay alive. I thought of Bishop's empty hat, of Daniel Wren's foot in the boot, of the bloodied man whispering about a door. And the people who've already gone. Bishop, Wren. Do we just leave them? Ray didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was heavy with resignation. There's nothing we can do for them. They're part of Crane's game now. I wasn't ready to accept that. There has to be something. Ray suddenly went rigid, his eyes fixed on something past me through the passenger window. His hand closed around my forearm. I turned to look. There was nothing there, just the fence and the empty desert beyond. But by the time I turned back, Ray had already started the truck. Not here, he said again softly. Never talk about it where it can hear. The monsoon broke that night, the first real storm of the season, and for a few days the desert turned green and the washes ran brown and fast. I kept to myself. The other rangers gave me room, probably warned that I was going through something. I caught fragments of conversations that stopped when I walked in. I tried to focus on the work, on the ordinary parts of the job, but the voice from the shaft stayed with me, and the fear it had dug out of me sat in my chest like a stone. 4 nights after the shaft, I was assigned a solo patrol out along the southern boundary, checking for flood damage after the storms. The night was clear but moonless. The desert past my headlamp a wall of black. I was working a wash line when I noticed something ahead that made me stop. A saguaro stood at the edge of the wash, an old giant, 30 feet if it was an inch, its arms lifted against the stars. But something was wrong with it. Something studded its trunk, catching my lamplight, dozens of small pale points arranged in spiraling lines up the length of it. I came closer, and my stomach turned. They were teeth, human teeth, pressed into the flesh of the cactus in careful spirals, ring after ring winding up the trunk. And from the lowest arm, 2 shapes hung swaying in the faint breeze. I lifted my lamp. 2 human arms severed at the shoulder, suspended from the spines by something I couldn't see, the skin gone gray-green and slack. I stepped back, fumbling for my radio, keeping the lamp on the awful thing. I needed to document this before I called it in. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and began recording, narrating low. Approximately 9:40 p.m., saguaro near the southern boundary. Grid reference 41. Human teeth embedded in the trunk in spiral patterns. 2 human arms suspended from the lower arm of the cactus. Decomposition suggests they've been here some time. I circled the saguaro carefully, documenting every angle. The teeth seemed to follow my movement, glinting no matter where I stood. The hanging arms turned slightly in the night air. After I had enough, I radioed headquarters. "This is Ranger Wilson. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible human remains and evidence of foul play." I gave my coordinates, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Copy that, Ranger Wilson. Investigation team is being notified. ETA approximately 45 minutes. Secure the area and hold your position." I acknowledged and settled in to wait, keeping my lamp trained on the saguaro. The longer I looked, the more unnatural it became. The teeth weren't placed at random. They formed patterns, symbols I couldn't read but that felt deliberate, almost like writing. I circled the cactus again and again, taking more photos, checking the ground for tracks. I found nothing. No footprints to or from it, no tools, no blood or tissue on the ground beneath the decomposing arms, which made no sense at all. Finally, I saw beams cutting through the dark and heard voices. The investigation team had come. 4 people, including a forensic specialist I recognized from earlier incidents. "Over here," I called, waving my light. The team approached, led by Senior Ranger Hale. I stepped aside and gestured at the saguaro. "Take a look at this. I've documented everything, but I wanted you to see it firsthand." Hale raised his flashlight, lighting up the great cactus. His expression stayed neutral as he studied it. "What exactly am I looking at, Wilson?" I turned to look at the saguaro. The teeth were gone. The arms were gone. The trunk showed no holes, no marks, nothing where the teeth had been pressed in, nothing where the branches had been rigged to hold the remains. The saguaro looked completely ordinary. "That's not possible," I said, moving toward it. There were teeth, dozens of human teeth pushed into the trunk, and arms, hanging from that branch right there. I ran my hands over the flesh of the cactus where the spirals had been. The surface was firm and unbroken. I looked up at the arm that had held the remains. Bare. "I took photos," I said, pulling out my phone. "Look." I opened my gallery and stopped. Just like the figures at the table, my evidence had vanished. The photos showed an ordinary saguaro. No teeth, no arms, nothing. The forensic specialist stepped forward. "Ranger Wilson, would you like to sit down for a moment? You seem shaken." "I'm not imagining this," I said, hearing the edge in my own voice. "It was right here. I saw it clearly. I documented all of it." Hale exchanged a look with the others. "James, you've been under a lot of stress. Bishop's disappearance, that business with the deer." "This isn't stress," I insisted. "There were human remains on this cactus, teeth and spirals, 2 arms hanging from the branch." The specialist spoke gently. "We'll still search the area thoroughly." They searched anyway, sweeping the ground for any sign of what I'd described. They found nothing, of course. After 45 minutes, Hale called it off. "We'll file a report," he told me, his tone carefully neutral. "Maybe get some extra patrols out here for a few days." I knew what they were thinking. I could see it in the careful way they wouldn't quite meet my eyes. They thought I was cracking up. Maybe I was. The drive back passed in an uncomfortable silence. I stared out at the dark desert rushing by, wondering if I could trust my own eyes anymore. The saguaro had been so vividly, horribly real. The teeth shining in my lamp, the arms swaying. How could something that detailed simply cease to exist? For the next several days, I kept my head down and did office work. The image of that cactus stayed with me, as real in memory as anything I'd ever lived through. 4 nights after the saguaro, I was assigned to patrol near Mirror Tank, an old stock pond out on the flats that held water after the monsoon. The night was clear and moonless again, the flat black surface of the tank throwing back the stars like a hole in the ground. Around midnight, I noticed something through the mesquite, light where no light should be. The nearest campground was miles off, and this stretch of the flats was hard to reach. I switched off my headlamp and moved toward the light, navigating by starlight. 12 years out here had taught me how to move quietly, placing each foot to avoid snapping a twig or rolling a stone. As I got closer, I could make out the source. A dozen or so lanterns arranged in a circle on the far side of the tank. Within the ring of light stood 12 figures in dark hooded clothing, their faces hidden. I crouched behind a low bank of earth about 100 yards off and watched. The group stood perfectly still, facing inward, toward something at the center of their circle. Then, as if answering a signal I couldn't perceive, they began to chant. The language was like nothing I'd heard. Not Spanish, not any modern tongue. The sounds slid between deep, throaty tones and high, almost musical ones. There was a rhythm to it that made my skin crawl, and at the center of their circle stood something disturbingly familiar. A door. A single door standing alone in the firelight, exactly like the one I'd found in the clearing. The chanting rose, more intense. One figure broke from the circle and approached the door, carrying something I couldn't make out. They set it against the base of the door, then stepped back into formation. I shifted, trying for a better view. My boots scraped against a rock, a small but distinct sound in the dead quiet. The chanting stopped at once. One of the figures turned and looked directly toward my hiding place. Even from 100 yards off, in near total dark, I felt them staring at me with impossible precision. The hooded head tilted, as if curious. Then, as one, all 12 figures began moving toward me. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, unnaturally smooth. They didn't rush or stumble in the dark. They simply came forward, steady and even. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, past caring about noise. Behind me, the chanting started again, louder now, seeming to come from every direction at once. The desert I knew so well stopped making sense. Landmarks looked wrong in the dark. Ground I'd crossed 100 times seemed to fold back on itself. My headlamp beam jerked and bounced, throwing wild shadows. I ran until my lungs burned, until sweat soaked through my uniform in the cool night. And finally I stopped, leaning against a boulder, trying to catch my breath and get my bearings. The chanting had faded, or I'd outrun it. I checked my GPS. The screen showed me miles from where I should have been. In a section of the park I hadn't been patrolling. That wasn't possible. I couldn't have run that far, not in under an hour. I switched on my radio. "This is Ranger Wilson. I need..." Static swallowed the rest, and through the white noise I heard, faint but unmistakable, that same chanting. I turned the radio off and kept moving, following the GPS toward the nearest road. Twice I thought I saw figures pacing me at the very edge of my lamp beam. By the time I reached my vehicle, the eastern sky was going gray. I'd been lost for hours, wandering in what the GPS track later showed as strange looping patterns that made no sense against the terrain. When I finally got back to headquarters, my supervisor, Stephen Cole, was waiting. He took one look at my state and steered me into his office. "What happened out there, James?" he asked, closing the door. "Dispatch said you radioed in a broken transmission, then went silent. We were about to send out a search party." I told him everything. The figures at the tank, the chanting, the door, my disorientation. As I spoke, his expression moved from concern to something harder to read. When I finished, he leaned back. "James, I'm going to be direct. I'm worried about your mental state." "I know what I saw," I said. "You've been through a lot these past few months. Bishop, the deer. Now this." His voice was carefully neutral. "I think you're experiencing stress-induced paranoia." "It's not paranoia if it's real," I said, hearing how defensive I sounded. "I'm placing you on leave, effective immediately. 2 weeks, paid. Rest. Talk to a professional." He slid a business card across the desk, a psychologist in Tucson who specialized in trauma. I stared at it, but didn't take it. "So that's it. You think I'm losing my mind? I think you're a good ranger who's been through something traumatic and needs help processing it." His tone softened. "Take the time, James." I could tell from his voice that his mind was made up. "Fine," I said, standing. 2 weeks. As I walked out, everyone watched me. They'd heard about the saguaro. Now they'd hear about this too. In their eyes, I was the ranger who was cracking up, but I knew what I'd seen. And I knew, driving home that morning, exhausted and furious, that this was exactly what something wanted. My removal from the park felt less like a coincidence and more like the next move in Crane's game. The first 3 days of my leave went by in a haze. I wandered around my small rented house on the edge of town, unable to sleep more than a couple of hours at a stretch. Stephen had told me to rest, to process, but I couldn't rest with the images running through my head on a loop. The teeth in spirals, the hanging arms, the hooded figures moving toward me in perfect step. I hadn't touched the psychologist's card. Talking to someone about what I'd seen would only end with medication I didn't need, or worse, I wasn't crazy. By the 4th day, I couldn't stand doing nothing. If the senior rangers wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it somewhere else. I started with the internet, searching for any mention of the park and its disappearances. Most results were ordinary missing persons cases with ordinary explanations. Dehydration, flash floods, a fall, nothing strange. I widened the search to local history and folklore. The land the park sat on had been home to people for thousands of years before it was ever a park. If there was something old out there, the old stories might hold a clue. A regional cultural center a couple hours away had a small archive open to the public, and I spent a long day there, introducing myself as a ranger, researching folklore for the park's education programs. Not entirely a lie. I went through recorded oral histories and transcribed interviews. Most of it centered on traditional practices, the seasons, the water, the animals. Nothing about doors standing alone in the desert or pale men with black eyes. As I was packing up, the archivist, a kind woman named Rosa, asked what exactly I was after. Stories about beings in the backcountry, I said carefully, particularly anything about figures who test or challenge people. Something in her face shifted. "You might want to speak with the elders directly," she said after a pause. "Some stories aren't written down. There's a woman named Esther Naquin who lives out past the reservation line. She knows the old ways better than anyone I've met. She doesn't talk to just anybody, but you can try." The next day I drove out to find her. Esther Naquin lived in a small adobe house at the end of a dirt road, with a ramada out front and wind chimes made of tin and bone hanging from the beams. She was well into her 80s, small and sharp-eyed, and she listened patiently as I gave my rehearsed explanation about educational programs. "The old stories," she said, nodding slowly. "Why do you really want to know about them, Ranger?" Something in her tone told me she wouldn't accept the excuse. "I've seen things in the park," I admitted. "Things I can't explain. I think they might be connected to something old." She studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes bright with an intelligence that had nothing to do with her age. "What kinds of things?" I told her everything. The bloodied man with the severed foot, the circle of deer, Bishop's disappearance, the doors that led nowhere, and Crane with his black eyes and too many teeth. As I spoke, her face stayed still, but I noticed her fingers tighten around her mug. When I finished, she set the mug down and reached for a small wooden box on a shelf. From it, she took a bundle of dried herbs bound with red thread. "Burn this in your home tonight," she said, pressing it into my hand. "It will offer some protection." "Protection from what?" "From the ones who watch." She glanced toward her window, though the curtain was drawn. "The ones who test." My pulse jumped. "You know about them." "My people have lived on this land a very long time," she said. "We have always known about the ones who watch from the spaces in between, the ones who test the strength of a person's spirit." "Test how?" "Through fear," she said simply. "Those who hold steady are respected and left alone. Those who give in..." She trailed off, looking into her cup. "What happens to them?" "They are taken, collected. The severed foot, the disappearances, Bishop. Is there a way to stop them? To get back the ones they've taken?" Esther was quiet so long I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. The Pale One is the most dangerous of them. He gathers people through his doorways, the passages he opens between one world and another. He has been here since long before my ancestors came. In our language, there is a name for him that means the one who wears a borrowed face. Elias Crane, I said. That's what he calls himself now. She nodded. He goes by many names across the years. He looks different each time, but you can always tell what he is by his eyes. They are cold and empty, with a very old hunger in them. The black eyes, I murmured. Yes. When you see those eyes, you must look away. To hold his gaze is to invite him into your mind. I spent nearly 3 hours with Esther, learning what she knew about the ones who test and their games. She told me stories passed down through generations of people who vanished after reporting strange structures out in the desert, of hunters who met beings that knew their private thoughts, of the rare few who resisted and were left afterward with a kind of second sight they hadn't asked for. Before I left, she gave me a small carved figure, a coyote with its head lowered, worked from pale wood worn smooth by handling. Keep this with you, she said. It will not stop him, but it may help you remember yourself when the moment comes. What moment? When you must choose your path. Her eyes held mine. Because you will face that choice, Ranger Wilson. I can see it in you. You are already caught in the borrowed man's game. The rest of my leave passed in a blur of research. I read what I could find about desert traditions, about liminal places and trickster spirits, about thresholds and the beings said to guard them. I filled a notebook with everything I learned, hunting for patterns, for some weakness. I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of doors opening onto darkness and of Crane's black eyes. I woke each morning worse than I'd bed. By the time my 2 weeks were up, I was running on coffee and stubbornness. I'd lost weight. My face in the mirror was thin, with dark hollows under bloodshot eyes. But I was more certain than ever what I was dealing with. This wasn't trauma. This was something old and hungry that had been hunting these washes and mesas for centuries. My first day back was a Tuesday. Headquarters felt subtly off. Everything just slightly wrong. My coworkers were polite but kept their distance. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Stephen watched me with a worry he didn't bother to hide. Good to have you back, James, he said in our brief meeting. How are you feeling? Rested? Rested, I lied. Clear-headed. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. I'm putting you on the front country trails today. Nothing too strenuous for your first day. I can handle my regular routes. Front country, he repeated firmly. Let's ease you back in. The front country trails were the busiest in the park. Wide, well-marked, popular with day hikers and families. Nothing strange ever happened there. Stephen was keeping me away from the remote country where I'd had my encounters. I didn't argue. Better to let him think I was cooperating. As I walked those trails that day, checking permits and answering questions about the wildlife, I felt eyes on me constantly. Whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just hikers enjoying the desert, birds working the mesquite, a ground squirrel freezing on a rock. Yet the feeling stayed with me. Something was watching. It went on for 3 days. I was assigned only to the busiest, most public parts of the park. At night I went home and burned Esther's herbs. The smoke was bitter, and I couldn't tell if it did anything or just made me feel less helpless. On Friday I made my decision. I couldn't wait any longer for answers. I needed to find a door again. Not to report it, not to document it, but to understand it. To test Esther's stories about passages between worlds. My shift ended at 4. Instead of driving home, I drove out to a remote trailhead near the northern boundary, an area where I'd found strange things before. I parked my own truck rather than a park vehicle, changed into hiking clothes, and headed into the backcountry as the light began to fade. This went against every protocol, every rule of safety I'd learned in 12 years. You don't go into remote wilderness alone at dusk. You don't deliberately seek out things tied to disappearances. You don't open doors that shouldn't exist. But I needed answers more than I needed to be safe. I hiked nearly 2 hours, moving off the established trails into the truly wild country. The desert darkened around me, but I kept my headlamp off as long as I could, navigating by the last of the natural light. I wanted to be hard to track. As full dark settled, I felt the change in the air. The ordinary night sounds died away until I was walking in complete silence. The temperature dropped. I switched on my lamp and swept it across the surrounding country. Nothing looked unusual at first. Then, as I finished a slow circle, the beam caught something that hadn't been there when I started turning. A door. Unlike the ornate ranch doors I'd seen before, this one was plain. Simple planks, a rope pull instead of a knob, weathered to a soft gray as if it had stood in this spot for decades. It rose alone from the desert floor, and I knew it hadn't been there a moment ago. I approached slowly, my lamp fixed on it. Nothing about it looked threatening. I forced myself forward until I stood at its base. This was it. The passage Esther had described. The seam between worlds that Crane used to take his guests. I took a deep breath and put my hand on the rope pull, and I opened the door. The pressure hit me at once, that same crushing weight against my whole body. But this time I pushed through it. My vision blurred and darkened. I stepped forward, over the threshold. The world changed. The desert vanished. The door remained behind me. But where it had stood in open ground, it now stood in the mouth of a passage. And the passage led down, into the earth, into a dark that swallowed my lamp beam a few feet in. I turned to look back the way I'd come and found no desert there. Only more passage stretching the opposite direction. Identical. Endless. The door had become a landing in a corridor with no beginning and no end. The air was thick and cold and hard to breathe, each lungful an effort. I called out, "Hello?" My voice came back muffled, deadened, and the walls of the passage seemed to shiver slightly when I spoke, as if they'd flinched. I took a step forward, deeper in. My lamp lit only a few feet ahead before the dark took over. I kept moving, checking the floor with my light, one careful step at a time. After what felt like minutes but could have been much longer, my watch had stopped the instant I crossed the threshold. The passage opened into a small chamber. As my light moved across it, I stopped. I was looking at my uncle's cabin. Not the whole cabin, but a perfect copy of the back bedroom where I'd slept as a child. The narrow iron bed with its faded quilt. The wardrobe with the door that never quite latched. The window with the warped frame that always let in a draft. This was the room where, when I was 7, I'd felt the fear that still surfaced in my nightmares. The lantern going out. The total dark. The thing breathing in the corner. The chamber grew darker even with my lamp on. The light reached less and less until it showed only a few inches in front of me. I heard a sound from the corner of the room. A slow, deliberate inhale, followed by a ragged exhale. "Who's there?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice level. The breathing went on, growing louder. I smelled something musty and damp, like old paper left in a flooded cellar. "I know this isn't real," I said, gripping the coyote carving hard in my pocket. "This is a test, a picture pulled out of my fear." A chuckle replaced the breathing. "Is that what the old woman told you?" I swung my lamp toward the voice. The beam found nothing but empty space. "These are just memories," I insisted. "You're taking them out of my head to scare me." "Are memories not real, James Wilson?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere now. "Are your fears not real simply because they live in your head?" The room began to change again. The bedroom dissolved. In its place, a patch of desert appeared, a bowl of open ground. At its center lay the bloodied man we'd found months ago, still clutching the boot with the severed foot to his chest. But this time he was looking straight at me, his eyes clear and focused. "He took him through the door," the man said, his voice stronger than I remembered. And now he's taking you. The man's body began to change. His bones cracked as his arms and legs lengthened. His skin thinned and paled until it was almost translucent. His eyes swelled and lost their color, going to flat black. Elias Crane stood up where the bloodied man had been. His smile stretched too wide, showing every filed tooth. "You're moving through the game quite well, James," he said, his voice deep now with that unplaceable accent. But his eyes were different tonight. Wet black shot through with a faint inner light, like the shine on deep water. "Few come this far." "This isn't a game," I said, fighting to hold my voice steady. "People have disappeared. You've taken them." "Taken?" Crane looked amused. "Is that what you think?" He moved closer, his motion too smooth to be human. "I open doors. I offer paths. Some walk through, some turn away." "Where are they?" "Bishop Daniel Wren." "They chose different paths in the game," Crane said, tilting his head at that impossible angle. "As will you." "I want answers," I demanded. "What are you? What is this place?" His smile widened past anything a human mouth could do. "Questions are part of the game, James. But not all questions have answers your kind can hold." The chamber began to change around us, the walls drawing inward. Dirt and small stones sifted down from above. "What's happening?" I asked, looking up as larger chunks of earth broke loose. "Time for you to choose," Crane said, unbothered by the collapsing walls. "Go forward or turn back. But know that each path has its price. I'm not playing your game." "You've been playing since you found that foot in the boot," Crane said. "Since you first felt watched. Since you first doubted what was real." The walls closed faster now, the space between us shrinking. I could smell his breath, cold as frozen metal, and under it, something sweet and long since spoiled. "There is so much more to see, James," he whispered as he began to fade before my eyes. "So many more tests to pass." The chamber collapsed entirely. Crushing weight pressed in from all sides. Earth filled my nose, my mouth, my lungs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Total darkness closed over me as the pressure became unbearable. I was dying, buried alive in a place that shouldn't exist. My chest burned. I started to black out. The last thing I heard was Crane's voice, somehow clear even through the earth packed against my ears. "See you on the other side, guest." Then the darkness took me completely. I came back to consciousness with dirt in my mouth. My eyes opened to a pale morning sky through the branches of a mesquite. I lay still. The desert. The door. Crane. I sat up fast. I was on the ground, sprawled on cold sand and gravel. My headlamp lay beside me, switched off but undamaged. The door was gone. Nothing remained to show it had ever stood there. No mark in the ground, no scattered planks, just ordinary desert. I searched my pockets and found my keys, my wallet, and the little carved coyote Esther had given me. As I pulled it out, I noticed a small wooden object next to where my head had been. I picked it up. It was a perfectly carved miniature door, no bigger than my thumb, complete with a tiny rope pull. I put both carvings in my pocket and checked my phone. It lit up. No service, not unusual out here. But the date made me sick. It read 3 days later than the evening I'd walked into the backcountry. 3 days. 3 days gone. Yet my memory only held what felt like minutes in that passage. My clothes were clean. My body showed no sign of 3 days in the desert. No sunburn, no hunger, no thirst, no cracked lips. I needed to get back. They'd be looking for me by now. The hike out took longer than it should have. I got turned around repeatedly, and country I knew well felt subtly strange. Twice I had to check my GPS to correct my course. By the time I reached the main trail, it was afternoon, and at the trailhead I found 3 parked vehicles and a county sheriff's SUV. As I came closer, several people turned toward me, rangers I knew, and 2 deputies. Their faces moved from surprise to relief to something I couldn't quite read. Marcus Hale saw me first. "Wilson, we found him," he called, jogging over. "Where the hell have you been?" Before I could answer, I was surrounded, questions coming from every direction. Was I hurt? What happened? Why hadn't I answered the radio? Where had I been sleeping? I'm fine, I said, the words strange in my mouth. I just need to get back to headquarters. Stephen was waiting at the station, his face tight with worry and barely held anger. He steered me into his office and shut the door. 3 days, James, he said low. 3 days, no contact, no trace. Your truck at a remote trailhead, no camping gear, no supplies. He leaned against his desk. Do you have any idea what we've been thinking? What we've put into finding you? I looked down at my hands. They were clean. Too clean for someone who'd spent 3 days in the backcountry. I'm sorry, I said. I can't explain it. Try, Stephen said flatly. I thought about telling him everything. The door, the passage, Crane. But Esther's warning stayed with me, and I already knew the senior staff had their protocols and wouldn't share what they knew. I went hiking after my shift, I began. I wanted to clear my head. I must have gotten lost. The lie felt hollow. My memory's fuzzy. I remember walking, and then waking up this morning. Stephen studied my face. You're saying you have no memory of the past 3 days? That's right. And you show no signs of exposure, dehydration, or hunger after 3 days lost in the desert in July. His skepticism was plain. I had no answer for that. He sighed heavily. I want you to go to the hospital. Full workup. Physical, neurological, toxicology. Something happened out there, and I need to know you're fit for duty. I feel fine. That's not good enough, not after 2 incidents in a month. His tone gentled. James, I'm worried about you. Not just as your supervisor. This isn't like you. I nodded, knowing argument was pointless. The hospital found nothing wrong. No injuries, no dehydration, no substances in my blood. The neurologist noted mild confusion, consistent with a dissociative episode, but could offer no medical explanation for the missing time. Stephen put me on restricted duty. Office work only, no solo patrols, mandatory counseling twice a week. I accepted the conditions without protest. I needed time to understand what had happened, to work out what Crane had meant by "see you on the other side." The little carved door sat on my nightstand at night. Sometimes I thought I heard it creak, as if something very small were working the tiny latch. The changes began gradually. First, it was the way the other Rangers looked at me. Quick glances when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Conversations that died when I walked into the break room. Even people who'd been friendly for years found reasons to be elsewhere when I was around. Then came the animals. On my first patrol back on limited duty, paired with a senior ranger named Fuentes, I noticed how the wildlife reacted to me. Birds fell silent when I passed beneath their branches. A ground squirrel froze on a rock, watching me with an unblinking eye until I was well past. A young mule deer on the trail looked directly at me, then bolted, ignoring Fuentes entirely. Never seen them spook like that, Fuentes said. Usually they watch both of us, or neither. I said nothing. I knew why the animals ran from me. They sensed something different, something wrong. The first object appeared 2 weeks after my return. I finished a morning patrol and found a small package wrapped in brown paper on the hood of my truck. No note. No explanation. Inside was an old brass compass, its face yellowed, its casing worn smooth. I checked it against my modern compass. The needle pointed north as it should. But as I walked a circle around my truck holding both, I noticed something. My good compass held to magnetic north. The old one's needle turned slowly, always pointing at me, no matter where I moved. I set it on the ground and backed away 10 feet. The needle swung until it aimed right at me. 20 feet. The same. I walked a slow circle around it, and the needle followed me perfectly, as if I had become magnetic north. I took it home that night and set it on my kitchen counter. From anywhere in my small house, I could see it pointing toward me, as if something inside it were watching. The child's drawing showed up a week later, tucked under my windshield wiper after I'd spent the morning checking trail damage with another ranger. It was on plain white paper. Drawn in crayon was a door, simple but clear, standing alone. Beside it stood a stick figure in a ranger hat, and behind the door, drawn as if the wood were glass, waited a much taller figure with long arms reaching toward the ranger, and where its eyes should have been, 2 heavy scribbles of black. My partner that day hadn't seen who left it. Probably some kid saying thanks for the Junior Ranger program, he said, though he looked like he believed that no more than I did. The photo was the worst. I found it inside my locked house on the kitchen table when I got home from work. A Polaroid showing me asleep in my own bed, taken from the bedroom doorway. The timestamp in the corner read 3:17 a.m., the night before. I'd been alone. My doors had been locked. The windows were latched from the inside. Something had been in my home while I slept, standing in my bedroom doorway, watching me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I sat in my living room with every light on, a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, watching the brass compass needle on the coffee table point steadily at my chest. By the end of the month, I was a wreck. Not sleeping had carved dark hollows under my eyes. I'd lost more weight. In my required counseling sessions, I dodged the truth and told the counselor what she wanted to hear. Stress, anxiety, trauma from Bishop's disappearance. Stephen called me into his office on a Wednesday morning. He didn't bother with small talk. "This isn't working, James," he said. "You're not getting better. If anything, you're worse than when you started restricted duty." I didn't disagree. "I'm concerned about your health and your ability to do this job safely." He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. "I'm recommending extended medical leave, 6 months minimum, with a re-evaluation before you come back to any duties. 6 months away from the park. 6 months away from answers. From Crane. From any chance of finding Bishop." "When?" I asked, my voice sounding distant even to me. "End of the week. Friday's your last day until spring at the earliest." He watched me carefully. "I can have someone clean out your locker if you'd rather not." "I'll do it," I cut in. "I'd like to finish out the week. One last patrol." Stephen paused, then nodded. "Eastern quadrant only, with Fuentes. No deviations." I agreed, though I already knew I'd break that promise. Friday dawned clear and cool, the first real hint that the season was turning. My breath fogged faintly as I loaded my gear into the truck. Fuentes was running late, a family thing, dispatch told me. They were finding a replacement, but in the meantime I could start checking the eastern trailheads. I headed for the most remote section, the country closest to where I'd found the door in the clearing a month earlier. The desert felt strange that morning. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots on the packed earth and my own breathing. In a small clearing about 2 miles in, I found the tracks. Adult prints, deep and clear in a patch of drying mud left by the last storm, and with them smaller prints, a child's. They ran in a straight line across the clearing and disappeared into the brush on the far side. I knew I should wait for Fuentes. I knew I should radio in my position and the find. I knew I should follow protocol. Instead, I followed the tracks. They led me through a stretch of country I'd walked dozens of times, and yet it looked unfamiliar now. The junipers seemed taller, older, their branches making patterns overhead I'd never noticed. The temperature dropped with every step, until I could see my breath hanging in the air. The tracks ended at the edge of another clearing, one that shouldn't have existed on any map of the park. In its center stood a door, unlike any I'd seen. Where the others had been plain planks or old ranch doors, this one was grand. Carved dark wood, tall as a church door, set in a frame that stood on nothing, worked with fittings that gleamed like gold. It rose from the desert floor complete in itself, and it stood open. Beyond it there was no desert, only a soft gray light and, dimly, the suggestion of a corridor going back and back. In the open doorway stood Elias Crane. His black eyes shone in the dim light. Beside him stood a thinner figure, and my stomach turned when I recognized Kyle Bishop. His skin had gone as pale as Crane's, and his eyes were flat and black. Crane raised a hand, his smile stretching too wide, showing every filed tooth. "Welcome to the final round, James Wilson," he called, his voice carrying perfectly despite the distance. "You've played admirably." Bishop said nothing, but his blank black eyes followed me as I stepped into the clearing. I knew what I should do. Radio for backup, document the scene, retreat to a safe distance and wait for help. All the protocols I'd followed for a decade. Instead, I walked toward the door, pulled by something I couldn't explain. I needed answers more than I felt afraid. I needed to understand what had happened to Bishop, to Wren, to all the others who had vanished over the decades. As I reached the threshold, I stopped and looked up at Crane and Bishop. I thought of Esther's warnings about one-way passages. I thought of the rangers who refused to speak the name. I thought of the bloodied man clutching a severed foot, whispering about a door. I put my hand on the frame and looked through. Unlike before, no pressure built against my body. No nausea rolled through me. Nothing tried to force me back. This time the door welcomed me. I stepped over the threshold. The desert behind me faded, growing less real with each step I took. The gray corridor opened ahead, and it was not the crushing tunnel from before. It was wide and still and strangely calm, and the further in I walked, the further away the fear seemed. The fear and the grief and the long, grinding exhaustion of the last 4 months, all of it thinning out behind me like smoke. Crane and Bishop walked ahead of me now, and I followed. By the 5th step, the sounds of the desert were gone entirely. By the 10th, the air had changed, thicker, heavier, with a smell I couldn't place, and, beneath it, something almost sweet. Crane watched me over his shoulder with that terrible smile. I understood, finally, why this door had been easier, why nothing pushed back. The other doors had tested me, and I had refused them, and by refusing I had proven myself worth collecting. This time I wasn't breaking a rule. This time I had been invited, and I had said yes. I reached the place where they stood waiting. Crane held out his hand, his long pale fingers reaching toward me. "Are you ready to understand, James Wilson?" he asked. "Are you ready to see what lies past the edges of your small world?" I looked back the way I'd come. The clearing was there still, distant and unreal, a bright rectangle framed by the open door, the ordinary desert I'd patrolled for 12 years, the sky going gold with the morning. I thought of my house with its every light burning, of the trailheads in the radio and the whole small human world I was about to leave behind. Then I looked at Bishop's changed face, at those black eyes that had once been so full of eagerness and life. Somewhere far behind me, faint as a memory, I thought I heard Esther's wind chimes, and the coyote carving was cold and solid in my pocket, and for one moment I remembered myself, standing at the base of that first door with a whispered warning ringing in my ears. "Not yet. Not your time. Step back." But it was my time now. I had walked all the way here on my own 2 feet. I took Crane's hand and I stepped through the last door.